Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here tonight, you've already done something quietly countercultural. You chose to end your day with an idea instead of a scroll. I'm really glad you're here. Before we begin, let's just arrive for a moment. Notice where you are right now. The room around you, dark or dim. The surface underneath you, the mattress or pillow holding your weight. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to be anything. Just notice the stillness you're already in. If there are sounds around you, a fan, the street outside, the small sounds of a house settling, just let them be there. You don't need to block them out. Let them be part of the quiet. Take one long breath in through your nose. And let it go slowly. Notice how your body relaxes just a little on that exhale. Try it again. In. And out. Here's something I find genuinely remarkable. The few minutes before sleep may be the most underused learning window in your entire day. As your brain transitions toward rest, it becomes unusually open to new ideas, and what you take in during this window tends to consolidate into memory overnight, more deeply than almost anything you read at noon. So there's something a little subversive happening right now. While most people are drifting off with their phones still glowing in their hands, you're doing something different. You're learning. Quietly. Deliberately. In the dark. Tonight's book is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, written by Mark Manson and published in 2016. Don't let the title fool you. This is not a book about apathy or not caring. It's actually about caring deeply, but about the right things. It's about how our obsession with feeling good is quietly making us miserable and what to do about it. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you like. And let's whisper through this one together. Mark Manson is an internet writer who built one of the most widely read personal development blogs in the world before writing this book. He's not an academic or a therapist. He's someone who spent years traveling, failing, overthinking, and gradually figuring out what actually made life feel meaningful and what didn't. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is, in many ways, the book that came out of that long, messy education. The book opens with Charles Bukowski. If you don't know Bukowski, he was a poet and novelist who spent most of his life as a broke, alcoholic, compulsive gambler who worked a dead-end job at the post office. He kept writing, kept getting rejected, kept drinking, and kept going. At 50 years old, a small publisher finally took a chance on him. He wrote his first novel in 3 weeks. He went on to sell millions of books. The obvious read of this story is that Bukowski never gave up, believed in himself, and eventually won. But Manson points out that Bukowski's own epitaph says something very different: don't try. Because the truth is, Bukowski didn't grind his way to success through sheer willpower and positive thinking. He succeeded because he was completely, unflinchingly honest about who he was, including the worst parts. He never tried to be something he wasn't. He never performed optimism he didn't feel. And that honesty, that refusal to pretend, is what made his work worth reading. This is where Manson begins his argument. We live in a culture that is obsessed with feeling good. Be positive. Be grateful. Be exceptional. Believe in yourself. And the problem, Manson argues, is that this constant push to feel better actually makes us feel worse, because it keeps reminding us of everything we lack. Nobody who is actually happy feels the need to tell themselves they are happy. They just are. Manson introduces what he calls the feedback loop from hell. You feel anxious. Then you feel anxious about being anxious. Then you feel bad about feeling bad about being anxious. The loop compounds on itself. And it does this because our culture has somehow decided that feeling negative emotions is unacceptable, that pain and discomfort are problems to be solved rather than signals to be heard. Here's his counter-argument, and it's the foundation of the whole book. We cannot stop giving fucks. It is biologically impossible. We are wired to care about things. The question is never, should I give a fuck? The question is, what am I giving a fuck about, and is it worth it? This framing shift is everything. Because most of us aren't suffering from caring too little. We're suffering from caring about the wrong things. We care intensely about what other people think of us. We care desperately about avoiding discomfort. We care about being right, being admired, being seen as successful. And all of this caring about the wrong things is exhausting. Manson's central idea is about what he calls values and metrics, the standards by which we measure ourselves and the world. Every time we feel like a success or a failure, it's because we're running our experience through some internal measuring stick. And if that measuring stick is badly chosen, then even genuine achievements will feel hollow, and small setbacks will feel catastrophic. He tells the story of Dave Mustaine, the founding guitarist of Metallica, who was kicked out of the band just before they recorded their first album. In response, Mustaine formed Megadeth and spent the next 2 decades turning himself into a metal legend, selling 25 million albums worldwide. And yet, in an interview years later, Mustaine broke down in tears. Because his metric had always been, be more successful than Metallica. And by that measure, he had failed. Then Manson tells the story of Pete Best, the original drummer of the Beatles, fired days before they recorded their first record. Best later said that he was happier than he would have been in the band. Why? Because life redirected him to a family, to a simple life, to new values. He changed his metric. And by his new metric, he had everything. This is the crux of it. The quality of your life is not determined by your circumstances. It's determined by the quality of your values. Choose good values, and your problems become meaningful. Choose bad values, and even your victories feel like losses. So what makes a value good? Manson offers a clear answer. Good values are things you have direct control over. Honesty, courage, creativity, vulnerability. These are internal. You can practice them right now. Bad values, being the most popular, being rich, being admired, depend entirely on external circumstances you cannot fully control. Chase those, and you're permanently at the mercy of the world. This is the subtle art, and it begins not with doing more, but with caring better. The second major pillar of the book is about happiness, and Manson begins with the Buddha. The story goes that the Buddha was a prince who grew up shielded from all suffering. His father built walls around the palace to keep out the sight of poverty, illness, and death. And despite every luxury, the prince was miserable. Because nothing meant anything when there was no contrast, no difficulty, no real stakes. When the prince finally saw the world outside, and saw people in pain, aging, dying, he ran away from the palace and swung to the opposite extreme. He starved himself. He denied himself every comfort. He lived in the dirt. And after years of this, he arrived at the same conclusion. Suffering for its own sake isn't meaningful either. What the Buddha eventually concluded, sitting under a tree for 4 to 9 days, was that life is inherently a form of suffering. Not because the world is broken, but because we are wired for dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction is a feature, not a bug. It's what drives us to keep growing, adapting, solving. Manson takes this idea and runs with it. Happiness, he argues, is not a destination. It is not a state you achieve by solving all your problems. It is the process of solving problems. The moment you solve one problem, a new one appears. This is not something to dread. It's just how life works. The better question, then, is not how do I get rid of my problems, but what problems do I want to have? Because the problems don't go away. What changes is their quality, and whether they feel meaningful to you. He puts it simply, what pain are you willing to sustain? Most people want the result without the struggle. They want the body without the training, the business without the grind, the deep relationship without the uncomfortable conversations. But those things don't work that way. The struggle is not separate from the reward, it is the reward. Manson tells a personal story about his teenage fantasy of becoming a rock star. He spent years imagining himself on stage, crowds cheering. He spent almost no time actually practicing. And when he eventually admitted to himself that he didn't actually want it, not the daily grind of it, not the boring practice, not the rejection of trying to get gigs, he stopped feeling like a failure about it. He'd never wanted the process. He'd only ever wanted the fantasy. This is a quiet and important distinction. If you love the process of something, not just the idea of it, you will naturally do the work. And if you only love the fantasy, no amount of motivation or willpower will carry you through. He also deals with what he calls the tyranny of exceptionalism. Our culture has spent decades telling people they are special and extraordinary. Participation trophies. Constant affirmation. The idea that every child has some unique gift waiting to be discovered. And the data, Manson says, is now in. This approach has backfired. It produced a generation of people who feel entitled to success without the discomfort of earning it. He introduces a character he calls Jimmy, a fictional but entirely recognizable type. Jimmy is always working on some amazing project. Jimmy is always one good meeting away from changing the world. Jimmy also hasn't paid rent in 3 months and is running out of aunts willing to loan him money. Jimmy genuinely believes his own story. And Jimmy is miserable, because reality has a way of eventually catching up. The problem isn't that Jimmy lacks confidence. It's that his confidence is completely detached from reality. He has sky-high self-esteem built on nothing. And the research on this is clear. Self-esteem that isn't grounded in actual competence or genuine values is not protective. It's fragile and dangerous. The real measure of self-worth, Manson argues, is not how good you feel about your successes. It's how honestly you can look at your failures and your flaws. The person who can say, I was wrong about that, and here's what I'm going to do differently, is vastly stronger than the person who can never admit a mistake. This feeds directly into his chapter on self-awareness, which he describes as an onion. The outer layer is knowing your emotions, just recognizing what you feel. The second layer is understanding why you feel those things. And the deepest, most difficult layer is understanding the values beneath the emotions, the standards you're holding yourself to, often without realizing it. Because often, the reason something hurts isn't what it appears to be on the surface. The guitarist who's devastated by criticism isn't just hurt by the comment. He's hurt because he's been measuring his entire worth by whether others approve of his playing. Change the metric, and the criticism stops being devastating. It becomes just information. The third part of the book is about responsibility, and it contains what is probably Manson's most important idea. He tells the story of William James, the man who would become the father of American psychology. In the 1860s, James was a wreck. Chronic illness, no career, a disapproving father, multiple failed ventures. By his late 20s, he had tried and failed at painting, medicine, and an expedition to the Amazon where he promptly contracted smallpox and nearly died. He was planning to take his own life. But before he did, he decided to run an experiment. He would spend 1 year believing that he was completely responsible for everything that happened to him, not necessarily his fault, but his responsibility to interpret and respond to. He would stop waiting for circumstances to improve and start treating every situation as something he could engage with and influence. He didn't take his life. He became one of the most influential thinkers in American history. He married. He had 5 children. He taught at Harvard. And he later called that year his rebirth. The distinction Manson draws here is between fault and responsibility. These are not the same thing. You are not always at fault for what happens to you. Terrible things happen to good people all the time. But you are always responsible for how you respond. Because even the choice not to respond is a response. Even the choice not to interpret something is an interpretation. This might be the most empowering and the most uncomfortable idea in the book, because it removes the comfortable role of victim. It says, even if you didn't cause this, you are still the one who has to decide what to do with it. He also introduces a concept he calls the responsibility-fault fallacy. We conflate these two things all the time. If something isn't your fault, you feel justified in not taking responsibility. But this trades away your power. The moment you say it's not my fault, so I don't have to do anything about it, you've handed over all your agency to whoever or whatever you've blamed. Responsibility, on Manson's account, is not a burden. It is power. The more you choose to take responsibility for your experience, not the events, but your interpretation of and response to them, the more capable you become. From responsibility, Manson moves into uncertainty. He argues that one of the most corrosive things we do is cling to certainty. We hold on to our beliefs about ourselves. I'm not the kind of person who does that. People like me don't succeed at this, because those beliefs feel stable. They give us an identity to live inside. And yet those certainties are exactly what keep us stuck. He calls this Manson's law of avoidance. The more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. The man who sees himself as a practical realist never writes the screenplay he's been planning for 20 years, because to try and fail would mean confronting the possibility that his self-image was wrong. Better to never try and never know. He also talks about the danger of building your identity around anything too narrow. If you define yourself as a brilliant entrepreneur and your business fails, everything falls apart. But if you define yourself more simply, as someone who tries things, learns, adjusts, then failure doesn't threaten your identity. It's just part of the process. There's a line in this chapter that I find quite beautiful. He says, don't find yourself. Finding yourself implies you've arrived at a fixed point, and then everything is about protecting that point. Instead, remain in a state of constant discovery. Let the version of yourself you are today be wrong about some things, so that tomorrow's version can be right about more. This directly feeds into his chapter on failure. Picasso is the example he uses. As an old man, Picasso was once doodling on a napkin in a cafe. A woman asked if she could have it and offered to pay. He said sure, $20,000. She was shocked. It took 2 minutes to draw, she said. No, Picasso replied. It took 60 years. The point isn't about the price. It's that improvement is built on failure. Every skill you have today is the product of thousands of tiny mistakes you made while learning it. If you were never willing to be bad at something, you can never become good at it. The willingness to fail is not the obstacle to success. It is the precondition. Manson talks about what he calls the do something principle. When he was struggling to build his early business, barely making ends meet, he discovered something his math teacher had once told him. If you're stuck on a problem, don't think about it, just start working on it. Even if you don't know what you're doing, the act of doing will eventually generate the ideas. Most people wait to feel motivated before they act. But motivation doesn't work that way. Motivation is often the result of action, not its cause. You do something small. That something creates a result. The result generates interest. The interest creates momentum. And the momentum becomes motivation. You don't have to feel ready. You just have to start. The final section of the book turns outward, from how we relate to ourselves to how we relate to others and to death. Manson's chapter on rejection is one of the most practically useful in the book. He spent years traveling the world as a digital nomad, 55 countries, dozens of relationships, constant new experiences. And what he eventually realized was that absolute freedom felt completely empty. There was no meaning in having endless options because nothing required commitment. Nothing was chosen, which meant nothing was truly valued. The idea he arrives at is this: meaning comes from rejection. That sounds strange at first, but think about it. When you commit to a relationship, you reject all other relationships. When you commit to a career, you reject other paths. When you say yes to something, you are implicitly saying no to everything else. And without that narrowing, without that rejection, everything is equally available and equally meaningless. He talks about his time in Russia, where he noticed the culture was extraordinarily direct. Russians don't perform politeness in the way many Westerners do. If something is stupid, they say so. If they like you, they tell you. He found it uncomfortable at first, jarring, even offensive. But then he started to love it. Because directness requires boundaries. And boundaries require knowing what you actually value and what you don't. He makes the distinction between healthy and unhealthy relationships using the concept of entitlement. An entitled person is someone who needs the world to behave according to their feelings. If they feel like they deserve something, they expect to receive it, and they feel victimized when they don't. The entitled person never takes responsibility for their pain, because their pain is always someone else's fault. But healthy relationships require what Manson calls defined limits, genuine, honest expression of what you will and won't accept. Not because you're trying to control others, but because you know what you value and you've chosen to protect it. He also introduces the concept of how to build trust, and it's counterintuitive. Trust is not built by being agreeable. Trust is built by being honest, even when it's uncomfortable. A friend who tells you what you want to hear isn't actually a friend. A partner who never disagrees isn't actually engaged. Real closeness requires the willingness to disappoint each other, to be honest about hard things, and to stay connected through the discomfort. Now, the book's comparison landscape. There are a few books worth mentioning here because they illuminate what makes this one distinctive. Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way covers some of the same stoic ground. The idea that adversity is not an enemy but a tool, that our response to difficulty is where our character is forged. Manson arrives at similar conclusions but from a rawer, more personal place. Holliday's book is more classical and structured. Manson's is scrappier and funnier. If the Stoic tradition appeals to you, reading both is worthwhile, as they cover the same psychological territory from very different angles. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is arguably the spiritual ancestor of this book. Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, arrived at a simple but profound insight. The last human freedom is the freedom to choose your attitude in any given situation. Manson's entire argument about responsibility and values rests on this same bedrock. Where Frankl fills a gap Manson leaves open is in the depth of his treatment of suffering as a source of meaning. Manson gestures at this, but Frankl lives it, and his book provides the philosophical and experimental depth that Manson's lighter touch doesn't always reach. Now for the honest critique. The subtle art of not giving a fuck has real limitations. The most significant is that the book is better at diagnosis than prescription. It's excellent at showing you how your values might be badly chosen and why that leads to suffering. It's somewhat less clear about how to actually change them. Knowing that your metric is wrong is not the same as knowing how to adopt a better one, and Manson moves through that transition a little quickly. The book is also extremely personal in a way that can narrow its applicability. Manson's own story involves a very specific kind of freedom: young, financially flexible enough to travel the world, working online. Some of his examples and conclusions are shaped by that experience in ways that don't always translate to a reader who is, say, raising children on a tight budget with limited options. Finally, the irreverent tone, which is a large part of the book's charm and accessibility, occasionally works against the ideas. Some of the most important concepts are introduced and then moved past quickly, almost flippantly, when they deserved more time. Frankl takes an entire book to explore the relationship between suffering and meaning. Manson covers it in a chapter. None of this undermines the book's real value, but it's worth going in knowing where it is and isn't complete. The last chapter of the book is about death, and it's the most quietly powerful one. Manson's friend Josh died when they were both 19, jumped off a cliff into a dark lake at a party, cramped up from the alcohol, and never came back up. Manson didn't let himself cry for 12 hours. Then he pulled his car over to the side of the road, called his dad, and fell apart. What came out of that summer was a kind of transformation. The experience of watching someone he loved simply disappear. No warning, no meaning, no explanation, left him unable to keep treating his own life as something that could wait. He stopped hiding. He started doing. He went back to school, studied hard, got his first girlfriend, began building something real. He writes about the philosopher Ernest Becker, whose book The Denial of Death argued that all human civilization is essentially our attempt to outrun the knowledge that we will die. Our projects, our legacies, our need to matter, all of it is, at some level, a shield against the terror of impermanence. And the book's final argument is this: when you stop running from the fact that you are temporary, something loosens. The small humiliations don't sting as much. The need to be right, to be admired, to be exceptional, it quietly dissolves. What's left is simpler and truer. Give fewer, better fucks. About things that are real, and yours, and worth it. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.